You guys may notice that we're a little short on music at the front end today from what we normally do. And actually, Doug and I ended up on the same page with that. He kind of back-loaded our communion time with music, and I actually added another song because what we're going to be doing today is a whole lot of reflecting. We kind of talked a lot about what we're going to talk about today last week, and so we're going to kind of re-hit it again, but what I want to do today that we didn't do last week was give you a pretty significant amount of time to sit and kind of reflect, to actually talk to God, to actually sit and listen from Him. So that's kind of what we're going to do today, but before we do, we're going to hit some of Psalm 89, which we've been in for the last 3 weeks, and we're going to be in for this week, and then one more week next week. We're going to finish it up. If you're looking at the bulletin, we're going to be straying a little bit from the normal sermon schedule. So if you were downstairs or if you're going downstairs and hearing Roger, it might be a little bit different than what we're going to go through up here for this week and next. Last week, we ended at verse 32. We're going to skip a few verses and go to the next section of this psalm, which starts in verse 38. So we're in Psalm 89 if you haven't been here for the last few weeks. And last week, we talked about I don't want to say the negative side, but the other side, if you will, of the Davidic covenant. What if we don't follow the laws of God? So the Davidic covenant has all these promises to David, to the king, and to this king who we then traced out would be Jesus. But then there's the other side of this covenant, which is what if we don't follow the laws of God? And so we looked at what happens when the people of God don't follow the laws of God, don't follow the statutes. And we basically concluded last week that when you don't follow the law of God or His statutes, there's discipline for the people of God. And we made the distinction between the justice of God, the judgment, Him as a judge, and our justification and what Christ did on the cross for us over here, and the distinction between that and God's discipline, His acting as a father in our life, His telling us you can't continue in your sin, you got to change your behavior, and how this is not the same as this. It's not as if God's punishing us twice. It's simply that He's dealing with multiple aspects of this sin problem. So this week, what we're going to look at in verse 38 on down to 45, the psalmist is going to give us a description of the punishment. So maybe last week you remember me asking the question, what's the punishment look like? And I said, I don't know. Because the punishment is different for everybody. It's whatever God knows is your hot button that He can press to get you to respond the way He needs you to respond, to get corrective action the way He wants it. 38 through 45 is going to be God's punishment for the king in this situation. What happened to the king when he didn't follow the laws of God? That's going to be verse 38 through 45. Now, you may remember also last week that we skipped a section. The first half of the second section of this psalm, we skipped it, and we said it's just a summary basically of the Davidic covenant. So it's 2 Samuel chapter 7 just kind of dumped over into the psalm, and it's just him describing the blessing that's going to come if the Davidic king is faithful and these sorts of things. And so we skipped over it because I wanted to talk about the what if we don't. Here's what's curious about verses 38 to 45, and you'll see this as we read them. Verses 38 to 45 is the direct opposite of all the blessings that it said would come from the Davidic covenant in verses 21 to 29. So the psalmist lays out all the blessings that are supposed to happen, and then when he starts describing what's actually happening, it's a direct opposite of everything God said He would do for this king. And so then the psalmist at the end of the psalm is left with these questions. How long and when is this going to end? These sorts of questions. Let's go through 38 to 45 real quick, and I want to compare them. I'll just reference you back to the verses in the second section so that we can see the contrast that's happening here, the reason why the psalmist is so distraught, why he's having such a problem. So start in verse 38. The psalmist says this to God, but you have cast off and rejected, you are full of wrath against your anointed. Okay, go back to verse 21 in the psalm. Verse 21 is the beginning of the promise. Maybe go back to verse 20. This is the promise that God makes to the Davidic king. I have found David, my servant. With my holy oil I have anointed him, so that my hand shall be established with him. My arm also shall strengthen him. So what's supposed to happen is God's arm is supposed to strengthen him. It's supposed to establish him, and the anointed one is the king. But instead, in verses 38, he's full of wrath against him. It's the opposite of the promise. Go back down to verse 39. You have renounced the covenant with your servant. You have defiled his crown in the dust. Go back up in the psalm to verse 24. God says this, my faithfulness and my steadfast love shall be with him, and in my name shall his horn be exalted. So in the promise, the faithfulness and the love of God will be with him, and his horn, that is a horn of victory, is exalted. In the promise, if the king follows the statutes of God. But in 39, it's not that. In 39, when he's actually describing what's actually happening, God seems to be renouncing his covenant and defiling this crown, which is supposed to be exalted. Go to verse 40. You have breached all his walls. You have laid his strongholds in ruin. Go backwards to verse 26. Sorry for those of you who have this on separate pages. He shall cry to me, verse 26, you are my Father, my God, and the rock of my salvation. The king is supposed to be crying out to God, the one who's saving him, the one who's his stronghold, the one who's supposed to be protecting him. But instead, what's actually happening is the walls of the king are being breached and his strongholds are being laid in ruin. It's the direct opposite of the promises that God seems to have made. Go one more verse, verse 41. It says, all who pass by him plunder him. He has become the scorn of his neighbors. And then go back to verse 27. God says, I will make him the firstborn, the highest of the kings of the earth. The firstborn in Hebrew culture gets a double inheritance. It's called a birthright inheritance. So here's the idea. If a father had 3 sons, the inheritance when he died would be split 4 ways, and the first son would receive a double portion, and then each son after that a single portion. So the promise is that the firstborn, this king will be like the firstborn, and he will be the highest of the kings of the earth. But what's actually happening is that all who pass by him plunder him, and he's the scorn of his neighbors. Last one, verses 42 and 43. We'll just read down through 45. You have exalted the right hand of his foes. You have made all his enemies rejoice. You have also turned back the edge of his sword, and you have not made him stand in battle. You have made his splendor to cease and cast his throne to the ground. You have cut short the days of his youth. You have covered him with shame. Go back all the way to the beginning, kind of that section, second section, verse 22 and 23. This is the promise of God to the faithful king. The enemy shall not outwit him. The wicked shall not humble him. I will crush his foes before him and strike down those who hate him. So instead of enemies not triumphing over him, the enemies are exalted and the king is turned back. It's just a description of what's happening, the punishment of God in this case, this situation. Whoever this king is, we don't know. This king is not experiencing the blessing of God. this king is experiencing the discipline of God. He's experiencing the second half of the covenant of what if we don't follow the statutes of God? What if we don't follow his law? Now, that part may be a little bit hard for some of us to connect with. It's talking about a king. This king's not standing in battle. I'm not sure how many of you have been in battle with a king. This guy whose strongholds are being plundered. I'm not sure how many of you have ever had your house destroyed or something like that by your enemies. This is a little bit hard to connect with, okay? You may be able to connect more with the psalmist's response. All this is happening. He's just described how if you don't follow the law of God, there's going to be punishment. And now the psalmist is going to ask these questions. And because what he's experiencing is, it seems like he's only experiencing the punishment of God in his life. And so he's going to ask these questions following. So start in verse 46. He says, "How long, O Lord, will you hide yourself forever? How long will your wrath burn like fire?" And then he makes this argument from the own brevity of his life. He says, "Remember how short my time is? For what vanity you have created all the children of men." He realizes he's not the only one going through these things. "What man can live and never see death? Who can deliver his soul from the power of Sheol?" In the Old Testament, the idea of Sheol was just the afterlife. Everybody went to Sheol. Until the New Testament, we don't have much of a concept of heaven and hell, a good dwelling place and a bad dwelling place. When everybody dies, they go to Sheol. And then Old Testament belief was that some point in the future, they didn't know when or weren't quite sure how, the righteous would be taken out of Sheol into the presence of God. But they didn't quite understand how that was going to happen. It's not till the New Testament till we understand this idea of heaven and hell. So in the Old Testament, everybody just went to Sheol, and the psalmist asks this question, who can deliver the soul from Sheol? The question would be answered, God. He's the only one in that case. So he's crying out to God, I'm going to die someday. All I'm experiencing now on earth is the punishment of God. So when are you going to deliver us from this? When does the other half of the covenant come out? I'm going to answer this question pretty simply because these are rhetorical questions that the psalmist never answers. He's crying out to God, asking when, but isn't the answer to the question pretty simple? If the covenant says that those who are obedient to God are blessed by God, and if they're not obedient, then there's punishment from God, then the answer to his question is pretty simple. The discipline will stop when obedience is restored. Now, here's the curious thing. The psalmist never says anything about his obedience. Technically, he never says anything about the king's obedience. He worships God at the beginning of the psalm. He talks about the Davidic covenant, and then he describes this situation that's happening. But in the Davidic covenant, the only people who are punished by God are those people who are not following his statutes. So you can kind of assume that at least the king, at the very least, is not doing what he's supposed to be doing. Curiously, the psalmist, who we know is not a king, his title is Ethan, the Ezrite. He's also experiencing the punishment of God. Last week, we were in Bible class, and Amy asked a question. Well, she didn't really ask a question. She posed this issue when we got to Bible class last week. She said, I've always been a little bit hung up on this idea that God would punish to the third and fourth generation. Why is it that other people are punished for the sins of someone else? How does that work? How's that just? How does that fit? That may not be very far off what's happening in the psalm. The king going off track, and the people of God are being punished for it. Now, it could be that the psalmist was also going off track and being punished himself for it, but we don't know that. Could be that he's being punished simply for the disobedience of the king. So how is that just? How does that work? She's getting that idea from places like Exodus 34. Let me read to you Exodus 34, 6-7. This is after Moses goes up on the mountain, gets the tablets, and he comes down, and the people are worshiping idols, and he's so mad, he throws the tablets of God on the ground, and they shatter. And then he goes back up the mountain, and he's like, yeah, the tablets are shattered, and God's like, cut some more stones, I'll rewrite them for you. This is the voice of God to Moses. Curiously, he's actually describing himself in this sentence. Listen to what it says, verses 6-7 in Exodus 34. It says this, the Lord passed before him, that is Moses, and proclaimed. This is what he said. The Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. Sandy, that steadfast love is Hesed. Keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, but who will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and the children's children to the third and fourth generation. So we have this idea that the effects of the punishment of God go out and out and out and out. Now, logically, this makes sense. If you consider an alcoholic parent, obviously kids are affected. Maybe even grandkids are affected. Maybe they had a grandparent, maybe they didn't have a grandparent because they weren't worthy to be in their life. If they live long enough, maybe they had great-grandkids who never got to experience the wisdom to the third and fourth generation. Logically, this makes perfect sense. Parents get divorced, and kids have a hard time. And then kids, all they know is divorced parents, and whether or not they get divorced in their life, they still have to deal with grandparents who are separated, and it goes out. Logically, this makes sense. The question is, how's God justified in this? We get it from a sin perspective. It makes sense logically how it outflows. But is God really the one doing the punishing? Or is that just the effects of our sin? In the Old Testament, there was no difference. In the Old Testament, they just believed that everything was controlled by God, something that we really struggle with. In the Old Testament, every effect came from God. So they had no issue in saying, of course, that punishment to the third and fourth generation comes from God. Now, some people have explained this passage away by just saying, well, it's because the sons and the daughters and the people to the third and fourth generation, they must have just taken on the same sort of sins as their fathers did because they learned them from them, they continued in them, and then obviously God then punished the children as well. Maybe. Possibly. Here's the reason why they try to explain it away. If you go to Deuteronomy 24, 16, I'm going to flip there because I don't have it written out. This is what people are trying to balance that Exodus passage with. Deuteronomy 24:16 says, fathers shall not be put to death because of their children, nor shall children be put to death because of their fathers. Each one shall be put to death for his own sin. And the same thing happens again in Ezekiel, in the book of Ezekiel chapter 8, verse 20. The prophet Ezekiel talks about how the soul of the one who sins is the one that will perish. The Son, again, shall not suffer the iniquity of the Father, nor the Father suffer for the iniquity of the Son. The righteousness of the righteous shall be upon himself, and the wickedness of the wicked shall be upon himself. So here's what we have. We have Exodus over here saying, God will punish to the third and fourth generation. Then we have Ezekiel and Deuteronomy over here seemingly saying, everyone's accountable for their own sin. Doesn't matter what your dad does, doesn't matter what your mom does, or your grandma, or your son or daughter, whoever. You're accountable for your righteousness or your wickedness, and so is the person next to you. So the question is, how do we balance these two things? How do we get around the idea that God punishes multiple generations and yet everybody's accountable for their own sin? You may remember last week that we put things in two different categories. That we said that in the Old Testament, they had this word punishment, and it had a range of meanings. Sometimes it meant punishment that was eternal as a result of sin for justification. We needed justification for this. Sometimes punishment in the Old Testament meant discipline. But in the Old Testament, it's hard to understand the difference between the two. I think it's happening here again. In Exodus 34, I think he's talking about discipline. That discipline extends to the third and fourth generation. That the punishment that happens to the father or the mother or the parents or whoever affects everybody else around them. Because the discipline is not just for them, it's also a warning to the people around them. You cannot live like them. Now, what I think Deuteronomy and Ezekiel are talking about is this justification problem over here. This problem that only Jesus could handle. So I don't think these are opposed to each other. I think what they're simply doing is describing two different aspects of the same thing. People get hung up on questions like these because they're confusing. And in the Old Testament, they seem a lot more confusing. Two different aspects of the same sin problem. This discipline is not a part of the judicial punishment of God. I don't think the children's children will be punished eternally for the sins of the father. Now that's clear in Scripture. Each individually will account for his own stuff. The effects of sin, however, are not contained. And neither is the discipline. That expands to multiple people around us. I gave you the warning last week that you cannot continue this year to make the same mistakes we made last year. That wisdom is in avoiding the punishment of God. It's in listening to his conviction and being changed, being transformed. Now, I don't know how many of you went home and was like, yeah, I need to evaluate my life. I need to look this stuff up and figure it out and do some soul searching and take a look in the mirror. I don't know how many of you did that. I hope many of you did that. But if you didn't, we're just going to do it today. If you did it last week, great. If you didn't, I'm going to give you some time to do it now. Here's the thing. We can talk about the punishment of God. We can do all kinds of warning. We can look at the punishment that God gave to other people in the Bible and say, wow, I don't want anything like that to happen to me. We should avoid this in our life. But reality is, if we don't take a few seconds to stop and sit to just commune with God in a moment saying, man, I don't want to continue in the same way, then it doesn't matter how much we talk about it. So, there's a psalm. It's Psalm 139. It begins in verses 1 and 2. This is David speaking. He says these words, O Lord, you have searched me and known me. You know when I sit down and when I rise up. You discern my thoughts from afar. So, what I want you to do for the next 5 minutes or so, I found a song, is self-evaluate. Ask God, is there anything that I'm not supposed to be doing that I should stop doing, or is there anything that I am supposed to be doing that I need to start doing? Is there anything that I was doing in 2017 that should not continue in 2018? What is it that I can do to be more like you? The song's about 5 minutes. I picked an instrumental song because some of you who love music may be distracted by words, and others of you who hate silence won't do well with that either. So it's about 5 minutes. Then I'm going to come up here and talk about communion, and then we'll have another chance to meet with God. But if you could run that song, just take a second to ask God those questions.